This is for a project for my psychology and sociology class. I am not a therapist or qualified psychologist. Any problems related to mental health or mental ailment/illness should be brought into light with someone that has a profession in the field. I am also a student, so although I believe otherwise, I am just not mature enough to tell you what you should take from this video, so tread lightly. Welcome. In this video, I'll be introducing the concept of the Freud personality theory, or otherwise known as the three phases of conscious. ID, ego, and superego are all associated with this. In this video, I will be describing the functions of the ID, ego, and superego, and how these can be put into real-world examples that can correlate with daily life. The information that I present will be accurate, but will be generalized to be easier to comprehend to a viewer that isn't aware of the concepts or have never dwelled on the premise of psychology. I recommend that viewers research this topic more in depth if they wish to have a better understanding of the subject. So, let's begin with the basic knowledge before we drill deeper into the subject. The name for this theory is called the Freud personality theory, which was made public all the way back in 1923. The purpose of this theory was the belief that the psyche was split into three sections, that being the ID, superego, and ego, which were all developed at different stages of your life. To briefly summarize the three terms which I will later be covering more in depth in this video, the ID, as pictured by Freud, is a person's instinctual desires or thought without reason. Next up being the superego, as pictured by Freud, is a person's ordered thoughts or idealized thoughts of their role in society and their respective culture. And finally, the ego, as pictured by Freud, is the mediator of all extremes. The purpose of these divisions is to represent the stages of the preconscious, the layers of a person's thought. For the sake of clarity, later in the video as I detail these divisions, I'll be using the iceberg image that will visually represent how deep in thought this layer is. You've already seen the iceberg thing, right? Hopefully. If not, you live in a rock. Anyway, with that out of the way, let us begin with the most surface level layer, which would be the ego. The ego, as stated and documented by Freud, is the
First and foremost, the bodily ego. It is not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface. If we wish to find an anatomical analogy for it, we can best identify it with the corticohomunculi of the anatomist, which stands on its head and the cortex sticks up its heels, faces backward, and, as we know, has its speech area on the left-hand side. The ego is ultimately derived from bodily sensations, chiefly from those springing from the surface of the body. It may thus be regarded as a mental projection of the surface of the body, representing the superfites of the mental apparatus.
Didn't understand it? I didn't either. So, to put it into easier words, the ego is practically your mediator between your thoughts. It can be described as the reality of yourself, while the other two concepts can be considered your extremes of yourself. The goal of your ego is to find a balance or compromise to the desires and wishes of the superego and ID. This part of thought is conveniently also the one that translates non-conscious into conscious action. To put this into example, let's use the angel-devil metaphor that the older children's cartoons use, which I don't think I was a part of that generation, unfortunately. In this case, the ego is represented by the person in the middle of the situation between the dictating angel and the devil. When the superego passes anxiety and the other feelings to the ego can subside these feelings by a set of defense mechanisms, which are employed as non-direct and non-conscious sets of behaviors. Examples of these behaviors include projection, displacement, denial, rationalization, regression, and sublimination. The ego can also be considered as your self-esteem, self-worth, the conscious thinking self, or in philosophy as oneself. As a person develops and comes to adolescence, the ego will develop as well, as it develops in cognitive functioning, defenses, and its interpersonal skill. Now, with that in mind, let's move on to superego. The superego is the reflection and internalization of cultured rules, the moral compass, or the principles that a person follows. The superego aims for perfection in the person, taking account of the ego's ideals, the person's spiritual goals, and conscience. This is the layer of thought that produces your feelings of anxiety or guilt when, according to your ideals, misbehaving or making yourself look like a fool. If you ever want to particularly remember the superego by just a single word, for whatever reason you wish to only remember that, then the greatest word to describe it would be the judge, because it's the crowd in the back of your mind that boos you whenever you're doing something unusual to you. Although the ego and superego are two separate layers, they both tie in with each other. As in, your superego targets your ego with the punishment of anxiety and other unrewarding feelings. We have already covered what the ego does with these later, so I won't be talking about it. According to Wikipedia,
While the more powerful powerful the Oedipus complex was, and the more rapidly it succumbed to repression under the influence of authority, religious teaching, schooling, and reading. The stricter would be the dominant.
With this in mind, let's move on to the deepest layer of the conscious, the ID. The ID, as stated and documented by Freud, is the
Dark and accessible part of our personality. What little we know of it, we have learned it from our study of the dream work, and of course, the construction of neurotic symptoms in most of.
Didn't understand again. Freud likes to be very cryptic and philosophical about his works. To summarize this verse, the idea can be considered the impulses and instincts in you. This is the most irrational, internalized, and silent voice in your mind. The idea holds all of your inner desires and aims for immediate satisfaction, while the counterpart superego acts as the antithesis of the idea. Although the ID is generally suppressed outside of clear conscious or preconscious thought, it could be said that it can come out sometimes. When you don't know why you did something at all, or you did something out of impulse, it was probably tempered by your ID. Now, this isn't an excuse to do something wrong and then say, well, it was my ID that did it, not me. Mainly because that you aren't in control of your ID, or anything else. The goal of the ego is to put the ID in check, so that it doesn't manifest itself outside of its most suppressed state, which is in the back of your head. To finish this off, let's read a verse by the greatest philosopher, Freud.
The whole person originally includes all the instinctual and.
Now, let us all combine this knowledge together and draw a relationship between the three and see how that contributes to the three functions. To put it simply, the ego is always a middleman. The ego takes an interest from the idea and dilutes it into a safer form, and where it fails to, will be confronted by the superego and confined by punishment with feelings of anxiety, guilt, and remorse. In cases where thinking was irrational or unreasonable, it may have just been because your idea have manifested into a more physical form, which, by the way, is out of your control, but whatever. In the end, the ego, superego, and the idea are all concepts thought up with Freud. Although if you searched up Freud on Wikipedia and scrolled through his theories, you'd find questionable theories that make you think, how did this random man influence the world so much? Well, he has been helpful with understanding deeper thought. And if you ever think about finding an example of these concepts, you've really been seeing these your whole life. All these concepts are subconscious, so you'll never really know when one is conflicting with the other, or one oversees the other, and so on. After all, you can't really think about how you think. You'll lose yourself before you even find anything interesting. That's why you're not a psychologist. Anyway, that took me a while, a lot of recording, and now I have to edit all of this into a video for a project in psychology. Anyway, thank you, bye.